Ran's kind invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And today I'm going to talk about the transient behaviors in population dynamics. And today's talk comprises two parts. The first part is the first project that I did about this transient dynamics. That was back to around 2019 when I was a postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Fischer. And then the second part of today's talk is about the follow-up work on transient dynamics. It's more about the applications to all kinds of the population models. If time permits, I'm also going to mention briefly about the ongoing and the future work that I'm currently working on in this transient field. So speaking of the transient behaviors, which is contradictory to what we usually understand about the dynamical systems, the transient behaviors mostly tells about the dynamics happen at the short or the intermediate time scales, whereas the asymptotic behaviors usually describe the long-term dynamics observed after arbitrarily long time. And then the classical analysis, including finding the existence of the steady states or the limit cycles or all kinds of those tractors. And then the classical analysis includes the local and the stability analysis. Now, the transient behaviors, which is different from the asymptotic behaviors, it tells us about the dynamical behaviors that can occur before a system reaches the asymptotic state. And what is important is that the transient behaviors can differ significantly from these asymptotic behaviors, which is also why we are interested in studying this particular behaviors. Now, sorry.
I like your definition, but then the ongoing definition is transient is anything other than steady state.
Yeah. Typically, anything that is not a steady state limit cycles.
No, this is good. I mean, this is what we understood, but there's an ongoing change of that definition.
Oh, I see.
By many other people.
I see. Thanks. So, why transient behavior is important? Transient, first of all, the transient behavior can be long-lasting and complicated. And I think I should put one reference here, which is a reference published by Alan Hastings and co-authors in 2018, and they analyzed all kinds of the population models which exhibit these long transient behaviors, which is not directly linked to what we did today, what I'm going to show today, but still, it's one important reference about those transient behaviors. Now, second of all, the transient behavior happens at a time scale that is most relevant to real life activities, because usually if you think about those long-term behaviors, especially for like infectious disease models, we actually care more about how disease is going to break out in short time scales rather than like over 100 years, right? And moreover, the human disturbances to manage ecosystems often operate on time scales much shorter than ecological dynamics. Now, the examples include the chemical spill in the water, which is sort of this one-time incidence, right? Rather than like repeated incidences over the years. Or the example includes the weather-induced flooding, or if you think about those human disturbances to ecological systems, we can think of the examples including the annual fisheries. And the common feature for the above mentioning behaviors is that it's actually the human's disturbance to ecological systems, and it's the one-time perturbation around this, let's say the steady state. So back into 2018, the real motivation for our work back then was really, one is by this Alan Hastings' work in 2018, but more it's about the Mike Newber's and Hal Caswell's work published in 1997. And what they studied, what they proposed back then is that they pioneered the notion about these transient behaviors in non-spatial systems. And in particular, what they proposed back then was that they they proposed these two notions. One is the reactivity, the other is the amplification envelopes. But of course, in order to propose these notions, they have to make some assumptions about their models. First of all, they assume that a system has an asymptotically stable steady state. And moreover, they have to assume that given a small perturbation around this steady state, and they analyze how these perturbations are going to grow or decay. Now, then followed by that, they define this reactivity. And what this reactivity is, it characterizes this instantaneous rate of change for a system when it's perturbed by this one-time incidence. And then the reactive system characterizes those perturbations that grow initially before this eventual decay. But the non-reactive systems characterize that all perturbations decay to zero monotonically. So there's definitely a huge distinction between these two. And then about this amplification envelope, it's the time evolution of the maximum relative size of a perturbation. And then this is a summary of the important references and the extension of our motivation. So following that work in 1997, then there is another work by the same two authors, and then they originally they studied this continuous time systems, but now in these references in 2005, they extended their work to the discrete time systems. And then there is another reference by these three authors, and they studied the link between this reactivity and this diffusive instability. And they showed that the reactivity is actually one of the necessary conditions for this Turing instability. Now, more recently, there is a reference about the transient behaviors induced by continuous time stochastic perturbations. And another reference extends the previous work where the perturbations are imposed to other state variables. But this extension actually generalized that assumption. And now the same ideas work for the systems where the perturbations are only imposed to a certain number of the state variables. And more recently, there is a work about the transients of non-autonomous systems which are subject to seasonal forcing. And then summarizing the results by far, what we observed back then was that the spatial effects are ignored. And then now this work, the work I'm going to present following comprising the part one is from the published work in 2019. It's published in Bulletin of Mathematical Biology. So what we did is that we extend the population models to include the spatial structures. And here is shown as model one, where we consider about the interacting species, where the GI represents this intraspecific interactions, and the FI represents this interspecific interactions, where we assume that for each of the species, they are able to diffuse randomly within their habitat. And then following by the same assumption, where we have to assume that eventually all the populations tend to a stable steady state. That is why we impose this Neumann's boundary conditions, because then we are able to obtain this spatial homogeneous stable steady state. And what our main goal back then was to derive this reactivity and the amplification envelope similar to what have been done for the non-spatial models. And by assuming that the system admits a unique positive steady state, we are able to linearize the nonlinear systems about this steady state. And this is our linearized system. And what is lucky is that now here has nothing to do with lucky. This is a natural result. We are able to obtain a linear operator. Now, the lucky thing comes into play here. Now we define this reactivity similar to the idea, similar to the work before. We define this reactivity to be this instantaneous rate of change, and then we divide by this norm of the perturbation, right? And then we evaluate this quantity at t equals to 0. So essentially, what this quantity measures is this relative instantaneous rate of change, And then we take the max over all possible perturbations, And here, we follow the same norms as the work pioneered by Mike Newberg and Carl Haswell in 1997. We take the L2 norm, which measures the Euclidean distance. All right, and because of that, we are able to obtain a very nice quantity for this reactivity. So basically, the reactivity is defined like this, but then it can be calculated by this quantity here. And what is more important is that because this L1, this operator is a self-adjoint operator, and therefore all the eigenvalues are real, and therefore the reactivity can be calculated as the largest eigenvalue of this operator. Now, for a specific example, if we consider about 2 interacting species, then the reactivity can be calculated explicitly as shown in the system 4. So here the Jij are those entries from the Jacobian matrix. And what we observe here is that whether a system is reactive or non-reactive, it has nothing to do with its spatial structures, at least for our model, where we have an interacting species and each species diffuse randomly within the habitat. The reactivity is solely dependent on these local interaction terms. And then we also define this amplification envelope. And the amplification envelope is defined like this. It tells about this time evolution of perturbations, and then it's divided by the initial perturbation. Again, it's taken as the maximum of all possible initial perturbations. And so actually this is the place which is different from these non-spatial systems, where for non-spatial systems, this amplification envelope can be calculated relatively easy from this matrix norms by like a lot of the softwares. But for like spatial systems, we aren't able to do that. But instead, what we are able to do is that we are able to obtain this upper bound for this amplification envelope. And this upper bound, or the log of this amplification envelope, is bounded above by this reactivity, and it's also can be bounded above by this largest eigenvalue, plus some other constants. Now, regarding the simulations or the numerical illustrations we have, what we did is that we choose those distributions that follow these Gaussian distributions. And here, the x0 is really the center of this perturbation, and the delta is the standard deviation for that Gaussian. And here, the dashed curves are those time evolution of 3 separate spatial homogeneous perturbations. And the solid curve is the illustration for that upper bound, for that amplification envelope that we were able to establish. And we thought that the estimates are reasonable. All right, and then from this numerical illustration, what we observe is that, well, if we compare these 2 curves, this dashed curve with this dashed curve here, what we observed is that if the perturbation is more localized, and then it's more likely that the perturbation is going to attenuate. By saying attenuate, I mean that the perturbation decay monotonically, but doesn't exhibit this initial growth or this transient growth before this eventual decay. And for this figure, what we showed is that, first of all, the solid curve again is the amplification envelope that can be calculated relatively easy for this non-spatial system. And for our spatial systems, we did two separate experiments. We either impose the small diffusion for the interacting species, or we impose large diffusions for those interacting species. But nonetheless, no matter the diffusion is small or large, the pattern we observe is consistent. And what we observed is that if the standard deviation is relatively small, it looks like that these perturbations are more likely to attenuate, meaning that the perturbations are more likely to decrease monotonically without those transient growth. However, if the standard deviation becomes larger, it seems like that those perturbations are more likely to grow before this eventual decay. Now, for the other experiment, what we did is that we actually verify this location for for x0. So x0 is the center of the Gaussian. What we observe here is that if the perturbation actually doesn't sit like in the middle of the spatial domain, but the perturbation actually initiates from the edge of this domain, then it's less likely that this transient growth will show. Yeah. The same for the other side, right? If the however, if again, still that depends on the standard deviation. Well, if the standard deviation is larger, meaning that the perturbation is more spread out, but still, it's more likely that the transient growth is going to occur. So the final experiment that we did for our project was that we also showed this possibility where for a few of the other perturbations, it's possible that initially those perturbations will decrease. However, at some intermediate time scale, those perturbations are going to rebound back and demonstrate this transient growth at these intermediate time scales before this eventual decay. And then next, I'm going to move forward to the second part of my talk. And then the second part of my talk is from our published work in 2020 at the Journal of the Theoretical Biology. So actually, after we finished the work about those transients in spatial systems, we actually paused for a while and tried to figure out what we should do next. So initially, when we tried to study those transients in spatial systems, the motivation was quite clear because we already know a bunch of the existing results in non-spatial systems, and then it's a natural extension to the spatial systems. But after we finished our project, we thought that, well, wait for a minute. Even for non-spatial systems, there are a lot of those uncertainties or a lot of those lingering questions that are worth of study. That is why. Oh, so I actually should say, in the middle, we also talked to Mike Newbert, and what Mike Newbert suggested back then was to study these transient behaviors in stoichiometric models, which is the same stoichiometric models proposed by Professor Kwang. And we actually initiated that project, but then in the middle we were totally distracted to something else. Yeah, I'll talk about for the last bit. And then back to the system here. So for going back to these non-spatial systems, what we are able to show is that, first of all, the scalar systems are not reactive, and it's not hard to show. This is really because still assuming that the scalar system asymptotically approaches to a stable steady state. And then if we linearize the system at the steady state, we are able to obtain this f prime, the derivative of that nonlinear function. And it's easy to see that if the f prime is less than 0, right, which is a sufficient and necessary conditions for the steady state to be stable, there is no way that the system is going to exhibit this transient growth. However, for a model of two interacting species, well, now assume that this still assuming that a stable steady state, a stable coexistent steady state exists, and then we can calculate the Jacobian about this steady state. And a straightforward calculation actually shows the conditions for the coexistent steady state or the system to be reactive, which is this inequality. And then what we are able to observe here, is that if those diagonal entries have the opposite signs, then for sure that the system is reactive. And what we are able to understand is that if one of the species is self-limiting and the other species is self-enhancing, then for sure that the system is a reactive system. Now, I think that for majority of those logical systems, the predator-prey models, the prey are self-limiting, right? But nonetheless, for a system to be reactive, we have other examples as well. For example, the prey species can be self-enhancing as well, such as those allele effect incorporated. Whereas the predator can be self-limiting as well, such as when the predators, let's say, compete for those habitats, right? So one is self-limiting, one is self-enhancing. And one particular example is those logical type of those predator-prey models. And the conclusion that we draw here is that for all the logical predator-prey models, those systems are generically reactive. This is really because the prey is self-limiting, and the A4 entry is 0, and the system is reactive as long as that off-diagonal systems, the summation of the off-diagonal system is not 0, which is very, very rare. All right, and another observation we have is that those reactivity actually depends on the scaling of a system. This is a fact that we actually overlooked for a really long time, because for asymptotic dynamics, it's a standard protocol to non-dimensionalize the system, right? To reduce the number of the parameters. However, for transients, we aren't able to do that. If you non-dimensionalize a system, and then that non-dimensionalized system may be reactive or non-reactive, which is very different from the model of the original dimensions. Now, what we are able to show is that for a simple illustration, let's consider about this two-dimensional linear system. Now, let's say if we choose this scaled variable, and then we can show that we can show that if the diagonal elements have the same sign, and then the scale system is reactive for large or small values of C, but not for like some intermediate values of the C, and which demonstrate the importance of these scaling issues when we study about the transients. And also in that paper, what we analyzed is those the reactivity for reactivity for systems that are subject to annual variation in temperature and other abiotic variables. But what we analyzed back then was that a system of an interacting species that are subject to this external forcing. And then now the right-hand side is depends on time, right? Depends on time, and we also assume that it's a T periodic argument for the first argument T. All right. So I think I'm almost out of time. But briefly, what we did back then is that we analyzed this so-called local reactivity. That is how a perturbation is going to grow or decay depending on a perturbation around this periodic orbit at arbitrary time along this periodic orbit. And we showed that this local reactivity actually depends very heavily on the time event where this perturbation is imposed on around this periodic orbit. So for this figure, I just want to highlight for these 3 points. Well, if the perturbation initiate at these 3 time events, in other words, at these 3 time events, and then the perturbation is going to grow before this eventual decay. Whereas if the perturbation initiate at a different times along this period, within this period, and then the perturbations are going to decrease rather than increase initially. So I think that I don't have enough time to go over what we have done for that work, but in principle or in summary, we analyzed the local reactivity and the period reactivity, where the period reactivity actually characterize how a perturbation is going to increase or decay after one period. And for this period reactivity, we are able to apply some techniques of like time periodic systems where we are able to reduce the continuous time systems to a discrete time system, reduce the dimension by 1, and use the series for those monodromy matrix. All right, and now overall, the big conclusion that we draw here is that the period reactivity will also depend on the timing of the perturbation. So about the ongoing and the future work. Well, of course, for all the work that we have done so far, we choose the L2 norm to measure those transients, which are those Euclidean space. However, the reactivity and the amplification envelope is going to differ significantly if we choose a different norm, such as the L1 norm. And there is another reference published in this year, 2020, by Mark Lewis and Pauline and Mark's student. And then they extended the result to the L1 norm. But what they studied is that a single species that could inhabit in different patches, but they are able to extend the transient, all those reactivity amplification envelope to the population models that is measured in L1. All right, and what remains to check is that the transients in models that intrinsically generate the periodic orbits. One example could be those Rosenweig-Mercator models, where the periodic orbits occur generically due to these Hall bifurcations. And in theory, there is a similarity and the difference for those intrinsically generated period orbits compared to those periodic systems that are subject to external forcings. And then one ongoing project, one ongoing collaborative project with Fristorf is those transients in stoichiometric models, as I mentioned before. This project was actually suggested by Mike Newbert several years ago. But I'm just glad that eventually we decided to resume this. We decided to resume this project, and as shown by Professor Kwang's work, because for stoichiometric models, then there is a regime where the classical predator-prey model, where the classic predator-prey relationship exists. However, there is a different regime. I think it's labeled as region 2, where the prey and the producer and the grazers compete for the nutrients, compete for the phosphorus. And what we are able to show right now is that, again, for those region 1, where it's a classical predator prey models, the system is reactive. However, for a different regime where the producer grazer competing for the nutrients, and the transients actually differ significantly, and that depends very sensitively on those phosphorus concentration and how those carrying capacity limited by the solar energies are. What remains to check is for what about those transients where the hop application occurs? Again, now that is linked to oh, hold on, sorry about that. That is linked to the ongoing project of 2. So I think I will stop here. And here are the important references. And lastly, just happy birthday to Gail. And I mostly work on predator prey systems for my entire PhD. So your works are inspirational. Thanks.